Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about a special topic, which we've sort of titled Storytelling Through Data. And so, you've heard that going through, evaluating cannabis banking for your institution is something that takes, a lot of understanding, and you need to understand who the businesses are and how they operate and things like that. Casey, why don't you talk a little bit about storytelling through data?
Yes, thank you, Julie. So hopefully there are some fellow data enthusiasts on the call today, and hopefully can find some interest and value in the data. I love data. So when we talk about data and storytelling, specifically as it relates to cannabis banking, I like to fall back on good storytelling. And I think that we are all pretty much aware of what those different aspects of information that would constitute a good story. So when we talk about those key elements of a narrative, one thing I do want to call out is that when we use the word narrative, we're not only referring to those FinCEN SAR narratives, but you would also be collecting narratives throughout the duration of any banking relationship, right? So when you onboard a new customer, you're going to be obtaining some information that's listed here, such as the who, where, and what. And those are really going to assist you in gaining an understanding of the business and their anticipated activities. And so from there, you will periodically review the data and the customer, again, to confirm that that story that they told you at onboarding continues to remain consistent with what you actually see when it comes to actual data. I'm sure you guys have heard data doesn't lie. And so it's a very unbiased view to information. And when you kind of pull these different components of a story and put them together, you're really able to get a clearer picture of not only the cannabis business, but the activities that they're doing.
So you saw this slide just a little bit earlier when Stacy was talking about the 4 critical cannabis banking workflows. And so today we're going to highlight sales validation. So sales validation in this particular industry means ensuring that the dollars deposited into your institution are the result of state legal sales. So what makes this so unique for these businesses? Well, think about this. If you're providing financial services to another type of business, another type of retail business, for example, a grocery store or a convenience store, you don't really care whether the person coming into the store is buying eggs and milk or bread. Aside from our recent pandemic, there's not really much of a limit on the number of loaves of bread you can buy or the number of eggs you can buy, things like that. So you don't have to understand all of the details of that business the same way that you do for a marijuana business. And that's because marijuana sales have to comply with a detailed set of rules that are set out by the state in which they operate. And so that's sort of where we're going to go in our story journey today, and understanding how that data can be used to support what is happening with that business, really understanding the way they operate, being able to make some predictions, and then following the data to see if those all sort of play out, and really kind of understanding all of the details. And so the first question is, where does this data come from? So how do we get this information? So there are 2 sources of data that are used for businesses in this industry. One is point of sale data, typically associated with retail establishments. They can be, a point of sale data can be used to manage retail inventory. I should say a point of sale system can be used to manage retail inventory. But in addition to that, it validates each purchase against any limits that are set by the state in which that business operates. We've talked about the fact that each state sets its own rules, its own regulations around their cannabis programs. And so there needs to be a way to ensure that these businesses are operating in accordance with those rules. If you look across the country in 2021, for example, the top 5 point of sale vendors in that retail space for cannabis businesses are Greenbits, BioTrack, FlowHub, MJ Freeway, and LeafLogix. But there are more. There are actually dozens more point of sale vendors across the country that work with each of these businesses. When you look to wholesale businesses, and by wholesale, I mean those who are not selling directly to a consumer, but instead are selling business to business. Wholesale vendors rely on solutions for inventory management and sales tracking. Common examples are QuickBooks and Sage Accounting or Sage Intact. And those resources record sale of product throughout the supply chain and up to the point of retail sale, right? So by the time it gets to the retailer, once it reaches the retailer, typically a point of sale system is used. And then the more granular detail surrounding those state requirements is captured through that point of sale resource. As far as required data, how do these two differ? Well, I talked about point of sale being used at a dispensary or a retail establishment. And that point of sale is commonly collecting information around purchaser eligibility. And as an example of purchaser eligibility, Paul was talking about the difference between a medical marijuana sale and adult use marijuana sale. So in a medical sale, part of the purchaser eligibility is to ensure that that purchaser has a current unexpired medical card issued by the state in which they're purchasing their product. On the adult use side, we're looking for age verification. So through any type of government issued ID, driver's license, passport, things like that. But we also need to know what is being sold, and that is captured through product details. And so you will literally see the detail of each product that is being sold as it's captured through that point of sale solution. In addition, though, we're also capturing or also being captured is information on the method of payment. And why is that important? Well, we talked about how cash intensive this particular industry is. And so understanding the amount of physical cash that has been collected by a business as compared to sales that were paid for via, say, an ACH transaction or perhaps a debit transaction is really important so that you understand the funds coming into your institution. In addition to that, some states do set limits on the amount of product that can be purchased either within a particular day or over a period of time. So when that's applicable, these point of sale systems help capture that information and track that information to make sure the business is operating in accordance with those rules set out by their state. Furthermore, hours of operation are important and they factor into that point of sale solution as well. Why it's important is because some states are very specific on the hours within which product can be sold. California is an example of a state that sets very stringent requirements that marijuana product can only be sold between certain business hours, and anything outside of that would be considered not a legal sale or a sale that was not in accordance with the state rules. When you're looking at solutions on the wholesale side, as I mentioned, for the business-to-business solutions, we're looking at things like QuickBooks and Sage Accounting, and there are others as well. The details captured there are not quite as granular because we're not talking about that ultimate consumer sale, but we're still capturing, or they are still capturing information on purchaser. So who's purchasing the product? Who is it going to? We want to make sure that we have an understanding of all of the participants in this particular area. We also want to understand what products are being sold, the quantity at which they're being sold, and again, payment type, because we need to be able to understand the cash coming into our institution. We need to be able to understand all of the transactions coming in, but cash especially, because we need to be able to attest to the fact that we have a comfort level that each business that we are working with is abiding by the rules set out by their state. Casey, do you want to talk about POS and invoicing data as it pertains to the Memo priorities?
Yes. So far we've covered the source of the sales data. And then we moved into the different data points that would be required or could be could be required as a part of collecting that information. So now what do we do with this data, right? So if you'll remember, one of the primary responsibilities that financial institutions have when it comes to cannabis banking is ensuring that those businesses are remaining compliant with applicable state and federal requirements. Specifically, what we're looking at here is the preventative measures that are listed in the Memo priorities. So one of those is preventing the distribution of cannabis to minors. So the way that this is collected, if you'll remember in the previous slide, there is the collection of identification. And so that is one of the data points that will directly address this specific priority. The Memo also prioritizes preventing the revenue from the legal sale of marijuana going to criminal enterprises, gangs, or cartels. And it's also meant to prevent state authorized marijuana activity from being used as a cover to conceal illegal activity. And so when it comes to the collection of sales data, you are able to address both of those priorities through comparing that data against the transaction activity that's actually conducted by a cannabis business in your institution. So you would essentially have processes in place to where you are ensuring that the deposits that they're bringing to your institution do not excessively exceed the volume of sales that you see through the extraction of that sales data.
So in addition to the priorities set out through the Memo, we're also given instruction on, or some guidance at least, on, what is considered a red flag? What is something that you might need to investigate? What might lead you to file a priority SAR, for example? So laid out in some of the guidance are some assertions. So for instance, the business receives substantially more revenue than its local competitors, or than might be expected given the location of the business. So thinking about that, it seems like a daunting task to understand how much revenue a particular business should be bringing in, and then thinking about, how does that compare to others? Well, details from that point of sale or invoicing system do give considerable insight, not only into the products and pricing, but in addition, you will have the ability to compare the way one business operates, similarly positioned business, compared to another business. And so you start to have an understanding, you start to really develop an understanding of what is customary and expected behavior for these businesses. And so if you have an outlier, that is something that you would be prompted then to investigate further. Now, maybe there's a reason. Just because something is indicated as a red flag doesn't mean that it actually is, or that anything untoward is happening. But by being able to do this pretty granular comparison, those things tend to sort of pop out and prompt you to investigate further, allowing you to attest to your ongoing monitoring of these accounts and being able to attest to the fact that as long as this pans out as not being something abnormal for a particular business, that the business is operating as we would expect. Another example is that the business receives substantially more revenue than might be reasonably expected, given any limitations imposed by state law. So we know that businesses can only sell X amount of product to an individual. We know that there's only X number of hours in a day. We can see how many customers they have. So we can, we're able to take that granular data and be able to sort of extrapolate some activity that we would expect. We're able to look at the data and determine whether it's reasonable. Is it reasonable for this business to be bringing in the revenue that we're seeing? And if not, again, that prompts us that there is something else that we need to investigate here. Again, just because a red flag is indicated doesn't mean there's something untoward going on, but we do have an obligation to make sure that we're investigating anything that is indicated as we're working with these businesses. Final example is that a business is depositing more cash than is commensurate with the amount of marijuana-related revenue it's reporting for federal and state tax purposes. So if you think back just a little bit, one of the things that we were talking about as far as information collected by businesses when they first establish a relationship with you, one of the things that we recommend and we commonly see is that tax returns are collected. And that will give you some insight into how much is being paid in sales tax and things like that. You can gain a lot of information. But getting this detailed point of sale data allows you to understand how purchases were paid for. Remember, this includes a breakdown of payment method, right? So was it paid for in cash? Was it paid for by an ACH or by a debit card? Understanding the way cash and other funds are moving through this business allows you to examine them through the lens of what is reasonable based on the other information that they're sharing with you throughout your relationship. Casey, can you try to connect the dots for us here?
Yes. So let's talk about connecting the dots, or, I like to refer it to data dots, connecting the data dots. So, going over all of the information above, we use a 4-ringed approach to kind of connect those elements together, right? So if you take a look at the first step, you're going to begin by collecting that data, that sales data, and then screening that information against those state mandated requirements, again, to satisfy that requirement of ensuring that you are facilitating, or that the cannabis business is facilitating only compliant and legal sales. And then from there, you start to move into analyzing that data as it relates specifically to the cannabis business that it's happening in. And so the way that you do that is comparing the data to that story, or again, that narrative that was communicated at the time of onboarding, and also comparing that data against historic information for that particular business. Essentially affirming that that story that the data tells today is the same, or it's consistent with the story that you know to be true about that business. And then the third step kind of expands that further to include the analysis of peer group sales data. So not only are you looking at that particular set of data, again, talking about that sales information, and you're not only looking at it to make sure that it's reasonable and that it makes sense with your particular and specific cannabis business, but you're, again, kind of taking a step back and comparing it against their peers in the industry. Is that activity consistent with that grouping of cannabis businesses? So once you get to that point, essentially you're at that point to where you can now essentially say that you have a comprehensive understanding of the customer, of the business, their sales activity, and are able to arrive at those conclusions about that business. And so again, tying those different elements of the data collected in your analysis, and then developing a comprehensive narrative, and then essentially, as that saying goes, tying or putting that final bow on your story.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie and Casey. It's great to hear how data is being used to really inform financial institutions in what they need to know about these businesses, how data can be used to identify that unusual behavior. And I really like that you point out how important it is to do that peer group analysis, particularly when you're new. It's hard to know if $20,000 a day for a dispensary makes sense. It's one of the great advantages of expanding your portfolio, is then you really start to understand what activity looks like compared to other similar CRBs. So Stacy, do you want to take us out?
Absolutely. This is the point in the presentation where we do give you a little 30-second pitch about GreenCheck. We, like as Paul said, we try not to make this a commercial. It's more about learning. But we do want you to know that we can help you as you build out your program. So we talked a little bit about the software, right? So we can put the software. It's a platform that sits between you and the cannabis businesses that you're banking. so that it can gather up and pull together data to present you with information that you will analyze as part of your ongoing due diligence. There's an onboarding workflow with collecting the due diligence documents that you need, license verification. So there's a bunch of tools in here that will help you manage your program. And then, of course, if you are still in that early phase where you want to walk through developing that business case and that presentation to your board, our advisory team will sit with you and kind of walk through those key points: that risk assessment, the financial model, marketing strategy, cannabis banking policy, getting you prepared to walk into that board and be fully educated on how you would build this program and what it looks like, so that you could make an informed decision about whether or not you want to bank the industry.